What if you walked into a tavern and time decided to stay there forever? That's what happened to John Blackwell, a cowboy who poked fun at fate one too many times. He was chasing a quiet drink after a long ride, but instead of whiskey, he got a meeting with something unexplainable. That night, the tavern was alive with laughter, arguments, and the clink of poker chips until the clock's hands froze dead at midnight. Step into this dusty tale and find out what happens when the world stops ticking. Maybe you'll learn something about fear, fate, or just when to quit joking around. Hey there, listener, how's it hanging? Where are you tuning in from today? John Blackwell's boots crunched against the cracked earth, each step kicking up a puff of dust that clung to his worn leather chaps. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, the sun baking his hat to a crisp and his throat dry as a forgotten bone. The town of Red Hollow was supposed to be a speck on the map, a place to grab a cheap whiskey and a cot before moving on. As he led his mare Daisy toward the only building with light spilling out, a squat, weathered tavern called the Rusty Spur, his stomach growled louder than the coyotes he'd heard last night. The sign above the door creaked in the faint breeze, and the smell of tobacco and sweat hit him like a handshake from an old friend. Inside, the place was a riot of noise. Men hollered over a card game, their voices slurred from too much drink. A woman in a faded dress leaned against the bar, laughing at something a wiry fellow whispered in her ear. John eased onto a stool, tipping his hat back to let the dim lantern light catch his face. He was lean, with a jaw like a cliff edge and eyes that carried the weight of too many miles. "Whiskey," he said to the barkeep, a heavy man with a mustache that looked like it could sweep the floor. The barkeep slid a glass across the counter, his gaze lingering on John a touch too long, like he was sizing up trouble. John didn't care. He was too tired to notice the man's eyes flicker toward the clock above the bar, its hands stuck at midnight. The room felt alive. Almost too alive for a nowhere town like this. A fella at the card table slammed his fist down, accusing someone of cheating, while another laughed so hard he spilled his beer. John sipped his whiskey, the burn cutting through the dust in his throat. He figured he'd drink, maybe play a hand or two, then find a corner to sleep off the road, but that look from the barkeep stuck with him like a burr under a saddle. Something about the man's stare said he knew more than he was letting on, like Red Hollow was waiting for something to happen, and John had just walked right into it. John Blackwell leaned back in his chair, the whiskey warming his chest as he scanned the tavern's chaos. The card game in the corner had turned rowdy, with a bearded man tossing coins onto the table like they were insults. But John's eyes drifted to the clock above the bar, a heavy brass thing that looked older than the town itself. Its hands sat frozen at midnight, the kind of detail you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. He squinted, thinking maybe the thing was broken, but the barkeep's earlier stare made him wonder if there was more to it. "Fine night for a game," John said, sliding into a seat at the card table, hoping to shake off the unease. The other players barely glanced up. A grizzled old-timer with a scar across his cheek, a young fellow with nervous hands, and a woman with a sharp smile who dealt the cards like she was born to it. "Deal me in," John added, tossing a coin into the pot. The woman smirked, her fingers flicking cards across the table. "Careful, cowboy," she said. "In Red Hollow, you don't just bet money." Her tone was light, but her eyes weren't. Halfway through the hand, John glanced at the clock again. Still midnight. He chuckled, trying to play it off. "That thing ever move?" he asked, nodding toward the bar. The old-timer grunted, not looking up from his cards. "Time's lazy around here," he said, like it was a fact of life. The young fella laughed too loud, like he was trying to convince himself it was a joke. The barkeep, wiping a glass, tossed out a line that landed like a stone in a pond. "Time slows down after your third drink, stranger. Ain't that right, folks?" The room erupted in laughter, but it felt forced, like everyone was in on something John wasn't. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on his cards. A decent hand, but nothing to brag about. The game went on, coins clinking, voices rising, but that clock gnawed at him. Finally, he stood, muttering something about stretching his legs, and stepped outside. The night air was cool, the street dead quiet. He expected to see the rest of Red Hollow, maybe a stable, a general store, something. But the street stretched out into nothing, just a long, dusty line swallowed by darkness. He walked a few steps, then turned back. The tavern's lights glowed behind him, same as before. He walked farther, maybe 50 paces, and stopped cold. There was the tavern again, right in front of him, like he'd never left. "What in the hell?" he muttered, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. John Blackwell stood frozen on the tavern's porch, the night air sharp against his skin. The street stretched out before him, endless and empty, looping back to the same creaking sign of the rusty spur, no matter how far he walked. He shook his head, trying to laugh it off. Maybe the whiskey was stronger than he thought. Back inside, the tavern was as loud as ever, the card players still bickering over their bets, the woman's sharp laugh cutting through the haze of tobacco smoke. John slid back into his seat at the table, his fingers tapping the worn wood, but his mind was still out there on that impossible street. "Something wrong, stranger?" the woman dealer asked, her eyes glinting like she already knew the answer. John forced a grin, leaning back in his chair. "Just wondering if this town's got more than one street or if it's playing tricks on me." The old-timer snorted, tossing a card onto the table. "Red Hollow's got its quirks. Best not to think too hard about it." The young fella, still fidgeting with his chips, piped up. "Yeah, like old Pete here says, it's just the whiskey talking. Or maybe you're seeing ghosts." He laughed, but it came out high and shaky, like a man trying to whistle past a graveyard. The room carried on. Glasses clinked, chairs scraped, someone cursed a bad hand. But John felt the air shift, like a storm brewing just out of sight. He glanced at the clock again, its hands glued to midnight, mocking him. "If time stopped," he said, loud enough for the table to hear, "maybe I'll finally win a hand without rushing." The young fella slapped the table, grinning. "Hear that? If we're stuck here, I'm getting my money back from Pete." The old-timer rolled his eyes, but the laughter around the table felt thin, like it was covering something nobody wanted to name. John kept his face easy, tossing a coin into the pot, but his gut twisted. He'd seen plenty in his years, rattlesnakes, bandits, storms that could drown a town. But this was different. The others were acting like nothing was wrong, but their eyes darted too quick, their smiles held too long. He caught the barkeep watching him again, polishing the same glass for the third time. John raised his drink, tipping it toward the man like a salute, but inside, a cold knot of fear was starting to tighten. Whatever was happening in Red Hollow, it wasn't just the whiskey playing tricks. John Blackwell tossed his cards on the table, the game no longer holding his interest. The tavern's noise buzzed around him, but his mind was stuck on that endless street outside. He drained his whiskey, the burn doing little to settle the unease crawling up his spine. "Gonna take another look," he muttered, pushing away from the table. The woman dealer raised an eyebrow but said nothing, her fingers shuffling cards with a rhythm that felt too steady for the room's growing tension. John tipped his hat and stepped toward the door, his boots heavy on the creaking floorboards. Outside, the night was still, too still. No crickets, no wind, just the faint groan of the tavern sign swaying above. John walked down the street, counting his steps to keep his head clear. 10 paces, 20, 30. The darkness seemed to swallow the world beyond the tavern's glow, but he kept going, his hand brushing the revolver at his hip. After 50 paces, he stopped, his breath catching. There it was again. The rusty spur, its light spilling out like nothing had changed. He cursed under his breath, turning to try another direction. Same result. The street looped him back every time, like a rope pulling him to the same damn spot. Back inside, the card players barely glanced up. John grabbed a bottle from the bar, ignoring the barkeep's knowing smirk, and rejoined the group. "This town's got a sense of humor," he said, pouring a shot. "Walked a mile, ended up right here." The old-timer, Pete, chuckled. "Told ya, Red Hollow's got quirks." The young fella, still twitchy, leaned forward. "Maybe it's cursed. Ever think of that?" John laughed, sharp and loud. "Cursed? Hell, I've seen scarier things in a saloon brawl," but his hand tightened around the glass. Desperate to shake the strangeness, John stood and fired his revolver into the air. The shot should have echoed, rattled the windows, something. Instead, the sound fell flat like it drowned in molasses. The others froze, staring. "Even the bullets here are lazy," John said, forcing a grin, but his voice cracked just enough to betray him. The woman dealer leaned back, her smile gone. "Careful, cowboy. Some things don't like being tested." The room felt smaller now, the air thick with something John couldn't name. He sat down, his bravado slipping, and poured another drink. Whatever Red Hollow was playing at, it wasn't letting him go. John Blackwell slouched in his chair, the whiskey bottle half empty and his patience thinner than a worn-out saddle. The tavern's air felt heavy now, like it was pressing down on everyone inside the rusty spur. The card game had fizzled out, the players' banter replaced by uneasy glances. John's eyes kept drifting to the clock, still stuck at midnight, its brass hands mocking him. The young fella at the table, whose name John learned was Tommy, fidgeted worse than ever, his fingers tearing at a napkin. "This ain't right," Tommy muttered, loud enough to draw stares. "We're stuck here, ain't we?" Before John could toss out a quip, the old-timer, Pete, slammed his fist on the table, making the coins jump. "Enough of your whining, kid," he barked. "You think you're the only one spooked? Grow a spine." Tommy's face reddened, and he shoved his chair back, standing so fast it tipped over. "I ain't scared, old man. I just want to know what's going on." The room went quiet, all eyes on the two men. John leaned forward, ready to break it up, but part of him wanted to see how far this would go. Maybe a fight would shake loose whatever was strangling this place. Tommy lunged, swinging a wild fist at Pete. The old-timer ducked, surprisingly spry, and grabbed a chair, swinging it like a club. It cracked against Tommy's shoulder, sending him stumbling, but no one cried out. No blood, no bruises, just noise, like a stage show gone wrong. John stood, his hand on his revolver, but he froze. The fight looked real, but it felt hollow, like watching shadows dance. Pete swung again, Tommy tackled him, and they crashed into a table, scattering bottles. The woman dealer, Clara, just watched, her lips curled in a half-smile. "Boys, you're wasting energy," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Pain's just a memory here." John's stomach turned. He grabbed Tommy by the collar, pulling him off Pete. "What the hell she mean by that?" he demanded, looking at Clara. She shrugged, dealing a new hand of cards like nothing happened. "Figure it out, cowboy. You're stuck in a play and the curtain ain't dropping." The room spun a little, and John's jokes dried up. He let Tommy go, who slumped against the wall, panting. The fight had burned out as fast as it started, but the truth was sinking in. They were trapped in a loop. And whatever this place was, it wasn't letting them feel anything real, not even pain. The air in the rusty spur turned thick, like the moment before a thunderstorm. John Blackwell stood by the overturned table, his hand still gripping Tommy's collar, though the young man had gone limp, his fight drained. The other patrons stared, their faces a mix of fear and resignation, as if they'd seen this scene play out before. The clock above the bar, stuck at midnight, seemed to loom larger now, its silence louder than the earlier brawl. Then the tavern doors swung open with a slow, deliberate creak, and every head turned. A man stepped inside, dressed in a long black coat that seemed to drink the lantern light. His hat was pulled low, hiding his face in shadow, but his presence filled the room like smoke. He moved with a calm that didn't belong in Red Hollow. Each step measured, his boots barely stirring the dust on the floor. When he spoke, his voice was low, like it came from somewhere deeper than his chest. "You folks wanted time to stop," he said, pausing to let the words sink in. "And here you are." The room went dead quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. John let go of Tommy, stepping forward, his hand hovering near his revolver. "Who are you supposed to be?" he asked, forcing a smirk to hide the chill running down his back. The stranger tilted his head just enough for John to catch a glint of eyes that didn't blink. "I'm what you asked for," the man said, his voice echoing with a strange familiarity, like it was pieced together from their own words. Clara, the dealer, leaned against the bar, her usual sharpness gone. Pete muttered a curse, but it sounded more like a prayer. Tommy just stared, his hands shaking. The stranger moved to the center of the room, his coat brushing the floor. "You laughed at fate," he said, pointing a gloved finger at John. "You ran from it." He nodded at Pete. "And you begged it to wait," he said to Tommy. The words hit like bullets, each one finding its mark. John's jaw tightened, his mind racing back to every flippant joke he'd made about death, every time he'd cheated it on the trail. The stranger's presence wasn't just a man, it was a mirror reflecting every fear they'd buried. The tavern felt like a cage now, and John's bravado was crumbling fast. The stranger in black stood motionless in the center of the rusty spur, his shadowed eyes scanning the room like a vulture circling a dying animal. John Blackwell felt the weight of that gaze, his usual quick wit stuck in his throat. The tavern's warmth had vanished, replaced by a chill that seemed to seep from the stranger himself. The other patrons, Clara, Pete, Tommy, stood frozen, their faces pale, as if the man's words had peeled back their skin to expose something raw. His voice, that eerie patchwork of their own, lingered in the air like dust after a stampede. Who are you? John asked again, his voice steadier this time, though his fingers twitched near his revolver. The stranger didn't move, but his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. You tell me, cowboy, he said, his words twisting John's own drawl back at him. You're the one who said fate's just a bad hand you can bluff your way out of. John's stomach lurched. Those were his words, spoken months ago to a drifter in some forgotten saloon. He glanced at Pete, who looked away, muttering, I never ran from nothing. But the stranger's head tilted toward him. Didn't you, old man? Kept riding to outrun your debts, your promises. Pete's jaw tightened, his scar twitching. Tommy, still slumped against the wall, found his voice. I just wanted more time to figure things out, he blurted, his eyes wide. The stranger turned, slow and deliberate. And you got it, boy. Forever. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as the stranger's words echoed their own regrets, their own late-night confessions. Clara, usually sharp as a knife, stayed quiet, her hands gripping the bar like it was the only thing keeping her upright. John tried to break the spell, forcing a laugh. Well, ain't you a charmin' guest? What's next, you gonna sing us a lullaby? The stranger's eyes locked on him, unblinking. Keep laughing, Blackwell. It's all you've got left. Nobody laughed. The air was thick with fear now, the kind that makes men forget their bravado. John's mind raced, piecing together the stranger's game. He was no man, but a reflection of their own voices, their own choices. Every quip, every dodge, every wish they'd muttered in the dark was being thrown back at them. The tavern wasn't just a trap, it was a mirror, and John wasn't sure he liked what he saw staring back. John Blackwell's hand hovered over his revolver, the weight of it grounding him as the stranger's words hung heavy in the rusty spur. The tavern's air felt like it was choking on itself, every breath a struggle against the growing dread. The stranger in black stood calm, his shadowed face unreadable, but his presence pressed against the room like a storm cloud ready to burst. John's heart pounded, but he forced his lips into a crooked grin. If you're here to preach, mister, he said, stepping forward, I'd rather settle this the old way. You and me outside. The challenge was a gamble, but sitting still felt like surrendering. The stranger's head tilted, his gloved hand brushing the edge of his coat. A duel? He said, his voice weaving John's own drawl with a mocking edge. You think a bullet can outrun what's already caught you? Pete, slumped in his chair, muttered, Don't be a fool, Blackwell. Clara's eyes flicked between them, her usual sharpness replaced by something like pity. Tommy just stared, his hands clenched as if he wanted to run but knew there was nowhere to go. The stranger nodded, slow and deliberate. All right, cowboy, let's see your hand. John pushed through the tavern doors, the stranger following like a shadow. The street outside was the same endless loop, the tavern's glow the only light in the swallowing dark. John squared his shoulders, facing the stranger 10 paces away. Draw when you're ready, he called, his voice steady despite the tremor in his fingers. The stranger didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, his coat fluttering in a breeze John couldn't feel. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable, until John's nerve snapped. He drew, his revolver flashing in the dim light, and fired. The shot should have roared, split the night open. Instead, it vanished, swallowed by a void that seemed to eat sound itself. The stranger didn't flinch. Darkness rushed in, thick and suffocating, blotting out the tavern, the street, everything. John's ears rang with a sound that wasn't there, a ghostly echo of his own laughter, sharp and bitter, looping back from every drunken night he'd mocked fate. He stumbled, his gun slipping from his hand, and the world went black. In the silence, that laughter grew louder, joined by Pete's grumbling, Tommy's nervous chuckles, Clara's biting wit, all their voices trapped in an endless refrain, mocking them from the void. The darkness lifted like a curtain, slow and heavy, revealing the familiar glow of the rusty spur. John Blackwell stood alone in the tavern, his revolver gone, his hands empty. The card table was upright again, but the chairs were empty. No Pete, no Tommy, no Clara. The clock above the bar still sat at midnight, its hands mocking him with their stillness. The air felt stale, like the room had been sealed shut for years. John's chest tightened, his breath shallow, as he scanned the silence for any sign of the others. Nothing. He stumbled to the bar, his boots scuffing the floorboards. The barkeep stood there, same as always, polishing a glass with that knowing smirk. Looking for your friends, cowboy, he said, his voice low and smooth like he was in on a secret. John leaned on the counter, his voice rough. Where'd they go? What the hell's this place? The barkeep slid a fresh whiskey across the bar, the amber liquid catching the lantern light. You held up well, Blackwell. Most don't. He set the glass down with a soft clink. Drink. You earned it. John stared at the whiskey, his reflection distorted in the glass. He wanted to smash it, to demand answers, but his body moved on its own, grabbing the drink and downing it in one gulp. The burn was real, but it didn't soothe the panic clawing at his gut. You gonna tell me what's going on? He asked, his voice sharper now. The barkeep chuckled, leaning closer. You walked into Red Hollow wanting a break from the road, from time. You got it. They all did. His eyes flicked to the clock, then back to John. But time don't like being ignored. The words hit like a punch. John remembered every flippant remark he'd made, joking about outrunning fate, cheating death, living like tomorrow was optional. The others had their own ghosts, Pete's debts, Tommy's indecision, Clara's sharp edges hiding something softer. Had they all wished for a pause, a way to stop the clock? John's hand tightened around the empty glass. The barkeep straightened, his smirk fading. You laughed at fear, cowboy, but it's still here waiting. The tavern felt like a tomb now, the silence louder than any gunshot. John turned toward the door, his heart pounding. He didn't know if he was free or if the loop was just tightening, but he had to try. The barkeep's voice followed him, soft but heavy. Good luck, Blackwell. You'll need it. John Blackwell pushed through the tavern doors, the creak of the rusty spur fading behind him. The street outside was no longer an endless loop. Red Hollow stretched out in the pale dawn light, its dusty road lined with a general store, a stable, a handful of weathered shacks. The air carried the scent of hay and horse, and a distant dog barked, sharp and ordinary. John stood still, his hand brushing where his revolver should have been, half expecting the town to vanish again. It didn't. People moved about, a woman sweeping a porch, a man leading a mule, living like nothing had happened. He walked forward, his boots heavy, each step testing the ground. The tavern's glow was gone, replaced by the harsh glare of morning sun. John's mind churned, replaying the stranger's words, the frozen clock, the empty tavern. Had it been a dream, a trick of bad whiskey? His fingers twitched, itching for the weight of his gun, but his holster was empty. He stopped at the general store where an old man behind the counter glanced up. You look like you've seen a ghost, stranger, the man said, chewing a toothpick. John forced a half smile. Something like that. You ever hear of a fella in a black coat talks like he knows your soul? The old man chuckled, shaking his head. You've been at the Spur too long. That place'll mess with your head. He went back to stacking cans, dismissing John's question like it was a bad joke. John didn't push. He stepped outside, scanning the faces of passers-by. No Pete, no Tommy, no Clara. Just strangers, moving through their day like the world hadn't stopped spinning. He wanted to tell someone, to spill the story of the night that trapped him, but the words felt foolish even in his head. Who'd believe a tale of a tavern where time froze and a stranger spoke your own fears back at you? John mounted his mare, Daisy, who snorted as if annoyed he'd kept her waiting. As he rode out of Red Hollow, the town shrank in the distance, ordinary as any other, but his eyes carried a new weight, a mix of fear and grim amusement. He'd tell the story someday, maybe over a fire with other drifters, but they'd laugh it off as a tall tale, and maybe it was. If you ever see a clock stuck at midnight in a tavern, he muttered to himself, don't order that second drink. The road stretched ahead, and John rode on, knowing some truths don't need believing to follow you. John Blackwell rode out of Red Hollow, the sun climbing higher, baking the dust beneath Daisy's hooves. The town was a speck now, fading into the haze of the prairie, but its weight clung to him like sweat. He'd seen plenty on the trail, bandits, storms, betrayal, but nothing like that night in the rusty spur. The stranger's voice, the frozen clock, the way his own laughter had turned against him, it all sat heavy in his chest, a story he couldn't shake. He leaned forward in the saddle, muttering to Daisy, if I ever stop for a drink again, you kick me first. The mare snorted, unimpressed. Days later, in a different town, John sat by a campfire with a couple of drifters, their faces weathered like his own. The talk turned to ghost stories, the kind cowboys spin to pass the night. John hesitated, then started talking. Ever hear of a tavern where time stops? He began, keeping his voice low. He told of the endless street, the stranger in black, the way the tavern seemed to trap their own words and fears. The drifters listened, one chuckling, the other spitting into the fire. Sounds like you drank too much, Blackwell, the first said. Or not enough, the other added, grinning. John just shrugged, his eyes glinting with something they couldn't read. Maybe so, he said, but I ain't going back to find out. As weeks turned to months, John carried the tale, telling it in saloons, at cattle drives, to anyone who'd listen. Each time, it changed a little, sharper here, softer there, but the core stayed true, a place where time didn't move, where your own voice became your jailer. Some laughed, some shivered, but none believed it fully. John didn't care. He wasn't telling it for them. He was telling it to keep himself sane, to make sense of the fear that still woke him at night, the echo of his own laugh ringing in his ears. Red Hollow became a whisper in his story, a warning wrapped in a joke. He'd ride on, through deserts and towns, chasing the next job, the next drink. But every time he passed a tavern, he'd check the clock first. Here's how it happened, he'd say, finishing his tale with a wry grin. And if you ever see a clock stuck at midnight in a tavern, don't order that second drink.